morning, everybody. Good to see everybody this morning. Just finished your breakfast. Here you are, all gathered around. This is so good. And you know what? We have another exciting story today. So how many of you remember what our story was about last week? Remember the little boy's lunch? He just had 2 fish, and then he had a few rolls, and that was all the food they had. But he wanted to give that food to Jesus, and he did. And you know how many people Jesus fed with that little tiny lunch? He fed 5,000 people. Now all of his disciples, after he broke all the bread and broke all the fish, they had to give out all the food to the 5,000 people. And they were exhausted. And you know what? When Jesus made that food last for 5,000 people, you know what they wanted to do? They wanted to make him king. They wanted him to be their king, because who's ever heard of somebody taking a little lunch and blessing it, holding it up to the Lord, and then it fed 5,000 people. So these people, they were there all day long, and they wanted to make Jesus king. But you know what? Jesus did not want to be an earthly king. He wanted to spend time with his Father. So he wanted to go up on the mountain to pray and spend time with his Father. And here it was getting dark, and the disciples were there, you know, and they were exhausted. Can you imagine serving 5,000 people? I can't imagine that. 5,000 people is a lot of people, and he did not have that many disciples, you know. Okay, so anyway, that is the setting for our story today. It was getting dark, and Jesus wanted to go up on the mountain. But our story today is that Peter was saved from drowning. How many of you have ever heard of Peter? The name Peter in the Bible. All of these stories that I'm telling you, and this makes about the 25th story. Can you believe that? I've been coming for like 25 weeks and telling you a different story, and all these stories come from the Bible. So if you have a Bible, then you can read these stories. Okay, today's story is that Peter was saved from drowning. And the memory verse is to look unto me and be ye saved, all the ends of the earth. That's taken from Isaiah 45:22. The scriptures today, if you want to go to your Bible and read this very same story, then you can. It's from Matthew 14:22 through 33, and Mark 6:45 through 56, and John 6:15 through 21. So those are the places that you can find this very story and read it. Now today, the thing that we want to learn and to teach is that Jesus is always ready to help us. Did you all know that? Jesus is always ready to help us. So now in today's story, it was getting dark. The disciples were exhausted from feeding all the people, you know, giving out all the food that Jesus was multiplying, the little boy's lunch. They were exhausted and they were tired, but Jesus wanted to spend time on the mountain in prayer, talking to his Heavenly Father. And you know what? That Heavenly Father is the same Heavenly Father that we can talk to today. And if Jesus needed to talk to his Heavenly Father, you know you and I need to spend time with our Heavenly Father. And so anyway, here it was getting dark. And all the people that sat around and listened to Jesus, they wanted to make him king, as I said. But Jesus wanted to go up on the mountain. So what did he say to his disciples? He said, take Peter's boat and go across the lake. So all the disciples were to get into Peter's boat and go across the lake. And Jesus said, well, I will come later. Okay? So they got into Peter's boat, all the disciples. They started across the lake. But have you seen the ocean when it's rough? I mean, the waters get rough. And so here they were exhausted, and here they were trying to paddle. They probably had to use oars. You know, they didn't have motors like we did. So anyway, they had to use oars, and they were so tired. And the waves were so big that they would try to get ahead, and they would just stay still. You know, they just couldn't move very much. Well, Jesus was up on the mountain praying, but he knew what his disciples were up against. He knew that the waves were so big. And let's put some waves up here. So here the disciples are in this little boat, and the waves were so big. And it was night. You know, already it was night. And guess what? It was lightning. I mean, dark, lightning, and the waves were so big. And here the disciples were in the boat. And they were trying to move across the water, but the waves were so big they couldn't move. And here it was, lightning. So, but did Jesus know what was going on? He was across praying, but he knew what his disciples were going through. So Jesus was there. He didn't have a boat. And guess what? Jesus didn't need a boat. Jesus could walk on the water. So here we see Jesus, and here he comes. He knows his disciples are in trouble. And Jesus doesn't need a boat. Remember, Jesus multiplied the little lunch, and Jesus could walk on water. So he didn't need a boat. So he came out to see the disciples and make sure they were all right. So the disciples saw this person, and you know that fishermen have a lot of ghost stories. And these disciples, now they were used to bad weather, but the waves were so big and they were so tired, they weren't used to this. So anyway, it's dark, and they see this person walking across the water. And it's dark, and so they say, who is this? This must be a ghost. And they knew a lot of ghost stories, because you know how fishermen are. They know a lot of ghost stories. And so they thought that he was a ghost. And so anyway, as he got closer and as the lightning flashed, they could see it was a person, but they couldn't tell who it was. So Jesus heard them say, you know, that they thought he was a ghost. So anyway, Jesus said, no, it is I. And of course, they recognized Jesus' voice. They knew it was Jesus' voice. But they'd never seen anybody walking on top of water. I mean, have you ever seen anybody walking on water? No. I've never seen anybody walking on water. And I would be just like the disciples. I would be scared. I would think for sure it was a ghost, but it was Jesus. And so one of the disciples, do you all know about Peter? Now, Peter was kind of compulsive. I mean, he was a great disciple. He and Andrew, his brother, they were two of the first disciples that Jesus called. And they were real smart. But Peter always, he didn't think before he spoke, you know. He was just a wonderful guy. And so he said, well, Jesus, if this is you, then tell me to come. If this is you, let me know, and I will come. So can you imagine, the waves were so big and the water was so rough? But here Peter was. He loved his Lord, and he loved Jesus. And so here he was in the boat, and he decided, when he knew that it was Jesus, and Jesus said, come. Can you imagine Jesus telling him to come and get out of the boat in these rough waters and come? But you know what Peter did? Peter got out of the boat. He crawled over the side, and he got out of the boat into the rough waters. And you know what? His eyes were on Jesus. Did y'all hear the song we played? Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face. Well, Peter loved Jesus. And Peter was looking at Jesus. And you know what? Peter was walking on the water. Can you imagine? He was walking on the water. But then, Peter was only human. And Peter took his eyes off Jesus. And he started looking around him at the rough waters. And you know what? When he took his eyes off Jesus, he began to sink. And you know what? Jesus was right there. And he said, help me, Jesus. Save me, Jesus. And so Jesus came over. And Peter was, he was almost going under the water. But Jesus took him by the hand and brought him over to the boat. And they got back in the boat. And guess what happened? They got back in the boat, and suddenly the waves were still. The lightning quit flashing. The storm went away. And Jesus was right in the boat with the disciples. And the water was just as calm as it could be. And you know what? The disciples bowed down, because this was as great a miracle as the fish and the rolls. Here the sea just calms down the minute Jesus gets in the boat. And Jesus saves Peter from drowning. And then Peter felt so bad, because Jesus said, Peter, why did you not believe? You know, but would you? I would be scared to death to just crawl out of the boat. None of the other disciples crawled out of the boat, did they? So Peter was pretty brave to crawl out of the boat and get in the water. And sure enough, he did walk on the water for a little while until he took his eyes off Jesus. So you know what? We need to keep our eyes on Jesus. And we need to pray, because Jesus is all powerful. And so when they saw how powerful Jesus was in calming the waters, they bowed down and worshiped him. So you know what? We have all these wonderful stories in the Bible. And so, we see how powerful Jesus is. And so, yes, and so that way we know. But Jesus, let's see, one thing I wanted us to remember is that aren't you glad Jesus was watching over the disciples? Why, that little boat and the waves so big, and he is watching over you. Did you all know that Jesus is watching over all of you? And he's watching over me. And Jesus is always ready to help us. When we need help, Jesus is always ready to help us. So we just need to keep trusting him. We need to trust Jesus. He will never, ever disappoint you or me. And he is all powerful. So now that's just another story that I'm telling you all. And so you just remember these stories and go back. Most of these stories are in the Gospels, which is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the first books of the New Testament. Most of these stories are there. So if you want to go back and read them, you can read them, or you can have somebody read them to you. So, but you know, each week, I'll come back and bring you a different story. So I'm not going to tell you what the story's going to be next week. It's going to be a surprise. So we will have another story next week.